If Daniel Penny had been a police officer, if instead of being a former military service person, he had had a uniform, a police unit, New York's finest, and he had subdued Jordan Penny, wouldn't it be an Eric Garner 2.0 kind of case? Wouldn't the Al Sharpton people, some of whom I gather were chanting outside of the courtroom, have been 10 times as many of them on the streets? And wouldn't the editorial opinion been much less friendly to the guy who subdued Jordan Neely than had proven to be the case here? And what do we have to say about that? In the news this week in New York City is the jury's decision to acquit Daniel Penny of murder charges in the death of Jordan Neely, of the homeless and mentally ill man who was harassing riders on a subway when Daniel Penny, ex-Marine and rider on that subway car, took it upon himself to subdue him. The consequence of which was that Jordan Neely expired. He was in a chokehold, and the chokehold proved to be a fatal move. It wasn't the intention of the ex-Marine good citizen to kill him, but he did kill him. He was charged by Alvin Bragg with a serious criminal offense. But
your friend Alvin Bragg, yeah.
Well, he is who he is. Alvin Bragg is. That decision, the prosecutorial discretion was deployed the way it was deployed. It was controversial, and there was a trial, and the verdict has been rendered. What's your take on that overall controversy? A lot of people are upset. I should mention that Jordan Neely was black and Daniel Penny is white, but we can make of that what we will. I gather from your piece in the New York Times that you don't want to make a big deal out of one being black and the other white, but more broadly, how do you read that situation, the jury's decision, the reactions to it, and so on?
Well, quite simply, if Jordan Neely, the one who was unfortunately killed, was white, this would have been a local New York story for about 2 days. The whole thing was made into a whole thing because of the racial aspect of it. And it's highly indicative of the kind of mindsets that we're talking about. Because there's a certain kind of person who thinks that Neely needed to be engaged somehow, that he needed help. And he clearly did. He was somebody who was on the street, clearly having major psychotic breaks, and the system failed him. He shouldn't have been out and about. Now, of course, there are people who still subscribe to that fashionable early, mid-1960s idea that we have to temper what we think of as crazy and that we're not supposed to take people like him in against their will. That's a whole other issue. But no, he was failed by the system. He certainly did not deserve to be killed, and Daniel Penny certainly did not mean to kill him. But some people say, well, he needed to be engaged. But I'm not sure those people ride the New York subway. I think there are other people, and I think it because I've seen it. I've heard it in conversation, and you see it in social media. There's a certain kind of person who thinks that white people in particular deserve him, Jordan Neely. He's running up and down the subway car saying menacing things with the body gestures. And, who knows if he's got a gun on him or a knife? You don't know. And really, I think a lot of people think that Karen, quote unquote, is supposed to put up with him because she is warp and woof, part of the warp and woof of a racist society. And so she deserves Jordan Neely. And I think most of the people who feel that way are white women in my experience. But I also know that anybody who feels that way is highly unlikely to live a New York City life. And I have been too often in a subway car with someone like that. You don't know what they're going to pull. Literally, they might have something on them. It's a limited space. Often you have a long time in between stops, and sometimes the damn train stops. And you're sitting there, and suppose your number comes up. And frankly, people do get killed in the subway too often. And so you're sitting there thinking, oh God, and you're hoping this person doesn't seize upon you. If you make eye contact, he might, but if you don't, especially if you're black, he thinks you're dissing him and then starts bothering you. I have had that happen to me. And if you're sitting there on the train with your children, and what are your children thinking? And what might you not be able to do? That's how it feels. And so when this ex-Marine takes that guy down, frankly, I not waiting for him to be killed, but Daniel Penny was doing a good thing because that person needs to be detained. And who knows what Jordan Neely was going to do because he was out of his mind. And Karen doesn't deserve that.
Okay.
And that.
Well, I was just going to try to fashion a pushback to say, needs to be detained, perhaps, but through a process of medical treatment that respects his humanity, needs to be restrained on the floor of a subway car with a man's bent arm around his neck, holding him so that he can't move and he can't breathe. Does he need that? That's a position that you have yet to argue for. He needs to be cared for is different from he needs to be dealt with.
Sure.
Sounds like you're saying the latter.
Well, he does need to be dealt with, unfortunately. I mean, unless somebody has some medicine in a syringe and they can just put it on his shoulder, he needs to be taken out of the car. And the only way to do it is either for two people to grab him, but maybe there aren't going to be two people who have the wherewithal to do that, or one person needs to grab him. And ideally, what would have happened there is he would have been in the chokehold for maybe 1 minute and then just pulled out of the car and let go on the platform, and maybe some police officers could have dealt with him. It was a tragedy that the man died. I'm not saying that that's what should have happened. It's a terrible thing. You read about his whole life story. But
needs to be cared for, needs services, needs a place to go, needs a sympathetic intervention. I mean, where's that in your calculation?
That should have happened long before. Jordan Neely needed serious help. I mean, the fact that there's so many people like him in the subway right now really does have me rethinking whether I want to live in this city any longer than I absolutely have to. It's a real problem. But to think mostly of the fact that the system had failed him and to dismiss Daniel Penny for what he did, as if it isn't equally urgent that this person who's out of their mind and threatening or talking in a violent way should be detained right then, is somebody with an astounding lack of empathy for what it's like to be in the New York subway. Unless, I suppose, you are a 400-pound, very muscular male. But then again, suppose this person has a gun.
Has a knife or a gun or a razor blade or
just
mace.
A razor blade. Yeah. And so it's
But excuse me, John, you're not worried about encouraging more Daniel Pennies of the world to act? I mean, this situation that you're describing sounds like something that happens every day in a subway car somewhere in New York City. There are going to be thousands of opportunities for Good Samaritan types to intervene and take action into their own hands. And is that a world that you would feel comfortable inviting to come into existence?
Yes, because his being killed was an accident. It's not necessary that whenever someone is detained like that they're going to die. It's not absolute. The fact that happened to Jordan Neely and it's gotten so much attention would mean that people would pay particular attention to someone not dying more likely. There were people standing there even then saying you're holding him for too long. And Daniel Penny apparently didn't understand. I think it sells people short to suppose that if more people detained these extremely disturbed men, that we would be all but ensuring that more of them would die. Daniel Penny was an ex-Marine. Like I could not have killed anybody that way. You know, I don't have the training. I'm probably not strong enough. It was a freakish thing that happened there. I will never forget one time being on the train, luckily without my girls. And there was a guy walking up and down the train car and larger than Daniel Penny and with a kind of a cocky pride about him. I hate to say black guy, maybe Blacktino, but probably black. And
isn't it almost always, isn't it almost always a black guy?
It is almost always a black person.
That's
not
very
Latino,
significant.
Black person. And black man. And he's doing this and he's clearly enjoying himself. I'm not sure whether he was crazy or just drunk and angry. It was hard to tell, but he was giving the women a really hard time, including, I remember this small Latina mother sitting there with her food. Her English might not even have been that good, but even if it wasn't, he's sitting there looking her in the face, clearly enjoying scaring everybody in the car half to death. And there were two police officers out there on the platform as we got to each stop, and, none of them are doing anything. And, I just thought, this isn't right. And for somebody to say that person shouldn't be detained because they're clearly having problems, no society owes that guy that. He needed to be pulled out of the train, and I don't think he would have been killed in the process. He probably needed to be taken either into treatment or jail for the night or something. But he needed to leave all these women alone. And Lord forbid if I had said anything to him, because I'm this snotty brother, and, he would have torn my head off. So...
No, you take your life into your hands if you engage somebody in a situation like that.
Because he might have a knife or a gun or a razor blade, exactly.
And as you point out, it doesn't matter whether you're 6'3" and 250, built like a linebacker or not. You could bleed out right there from a slash across your throat from one of these people. So I definitely see the problem.
Now, there's a certain kind of person who's saying we're demonizing those guys. But no, this is the truth. And if you think we're demonizing these guys, you don't ride the train. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, well, I don't ride the train, but I can empathize with and you being there with your kids and feeling intimidated. Think about the feelings of power. I gather this goes both ways. I think on the performance that is so intimidating is a kind of power play on the part of the individual who's engaged in it, right? He's taking control or command. He's daring you to do something. He's in your face. He's, whatever internal psychological benefits he is getting from it, power has something to do with it, dominating that situation, daring you. And when you don't get up, I can imagine myself sitting there being intimidated and feeling anger for the fear that has been induced in me, and recognizing, I'm not getting up because I'm afraid of the consequences of getting up. This dude is in my face, and I'm hoping that he moves on to the next person. Oh my God, isn't that a position of weakness? How pathetic, how sad. My pride is wounded by being affronted in that way. I just had a thought. If Daniel Penny had been a police officer, if instead of being a former military service person, he had had a uniform, a police unit of New York's finest, and he had subdued Jordan Penny, wouldn't it be an Eric Garner 2.0 kind of case? Wouldn't the Al Sharpton people, some of whom I gather were chanting outside of the courtroom, have been 10 times as many of them on the streets? And wouldn't the editorial opinion been much less friendly to the guy who subdued Jordan Neely than had proven to be the case here? And what do we have to say about that?